everybody. It's very, very good to see all of you here and some familiar faces of people that we work with a lot. Can I invite the panelists to come up onto the stage? Yes, I'll sit here. Thank you. Everyone, this session is focused on the lessons that we've learned from beginning the implementation of the just energy transition in South Africa. So we're going to speak honestly about the process that we've been through so far, and we are engaging with a number of other countries that are embarking on a similar journey. So it's quite important that we share the lessons and we share our experiences. My name is Sue Lund. I am in the Just Energy Transition Projects Management Unit in the Presidency in South Africa. My colleague Joanne Jarvich was due to be chairing this session, but she is now speaking at a German embassy event. So we've had to share roles. So I'm partly on the panel and I'm partly chairing today. Yeah, thanks, Ryan. No, it's a classic COP problem, I think. Yeah. So I'm very pleased to introduce you today to our panelists. We have got a full program, but we've got a full 90 minutes. So actually, we've got time to get through what I think is an important conversation. I think many of you were at the presentation of the launch of the JET implementation plan yesterday, and so we're going to assume that there's some level of understanding of what's in the JET implementation plan for South Africa, but we're going to try to highlight lessons that we've learned in the process that we've gone through so far. So the first speaker will be my colleague Neil Cole, who is the financing manager in the JET IP Projects Management Unit in the Presidency. He and I work closely together on driving the implementation of the JET IP, and he will be sharing some key lessons, challenges, and opportunities that have come forward from this initial process. Then we have with us Chris Taylor, who is representing the United Kingdom government in the portfolio of JET in the UK. And the UK heads the International Partners Group that has partnered with South Africa for rallying finance to support South Africa. So Chris is our main lead based in the UK, and then we have his colleagues in Pretoria who work with us as well through the IPG. So Chris will be joining us to share their perspectives and their insights into the process we've been through. And then Rainer Backer is the German special envoy for the JET energy transition and leads the German team that is working with us in South Africa. Rainer, it's lovely to have you with us as well. Thank you for joining us. And we'll be sharing from Germany's perspective what we've been through. And then I will wrap up at the end with just talking about next steps on the implementation of the JET IP and where our focus is. And then we'll have a discussion, and hopefully we'll have a reasonable time for your questions and inputs and your thoughts on your perspective on the challenges and lessons and opportunities that we have. So I look forward to this conversation. And I think let's kick off, Neil, with your presentation, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue, and also from our side, welcome. As Sue said, I'm going to go through some of the challenges that we thought would be pertinent for this forum. They certainly not the full gambit of challenges, but the ones that we feel are certainly the most important. And then I'll be going into some of the lessons that we've derived from the process of not only drafting the JET investment plan, but also what we've been spending our time on over the past 8 months on drafting an implementation plan for the JET investment plan. And then I'll end with some opportunities. So if we can move, I have to move the presentation forward. Yes, okay. So just on the challenges, I mean, the first would be on cost implications, and this is not just about the 85 billion or so US dollars that we've costed what our 5-year jet investment plan is going to cost across the portfolios that we've identified, but also the cost of capital, both on the sort of commercial debt and equity, as well as on the concessional loans that we've identified already, and the level of concession loans that we would need to mobilize. And that 85 billion number, like most big numbers and most financing gaps, can be quite intimidating and sometimes even leads to a bit of a paralysis and a lot of sort of ignoring the number, right? And I think part of what it is that we want to do as a PMU in tackling that challenge is to look at, so how do we make sense of that 85 billion number? And I'll get to some of the opportunities later. The second is not just the quantum, but also the quality of MDB and DFI financing that needs to be at levels and also need to take the form that would enable countries to mobilize that source of financing and to deploy that financing in a way that's not going to lead to unsustainable debt levels. The third is just aligning the various stakeholder interests and ensuring that affected communities are involved in decision making. And the point also here is that it needs to be combined with the sort of taking into account the limited public awareness, but at the same time, in undertaking these consultations, it's also about hearing what the different views are in the approach that we need to take, and how those different views are taken on board. So it can't be just about speaking to the converted. It can't just be about speaking to those that we agree with and that agree with us. Grid integration is definitely a big constraint in South Africa in terms of the current requirements for our renewable energy build, but also the future plans. For those not familiar with South Africa's geography, our grid runs largely from the north of the country to the south of the country. We need to be taking our grid to the coastal regions and also to other inland areas where our renewable resources are. And then as we get into the implementation of the investment plan, recruiting the requisite project management skills is going to be key across the portfolios that we've identified: electricity, NEVs, green hydrogen, skills, the work that we need to be doing with municipalities, etc. And then the pace of regulatory reforms. I think we've been doing well as a country in terms of our regulatory reforms, the recent removal of the cap on renewable energy in investments that can be undertaken, the incentives that have been provided for households and businesses to invest in solar systems. The one statistic that is always excites us is that we've imported 3.4 gigawatts of solar panels, which is about the equivalent to one of our better performing coal power stations. And furthermore, on that 3.4 gigawatt is that that's the second fastest increase in solar panel installations after Europe. So I think rather impressive in terms of the pace that we've made with the regulatory reforms. It obviously comes now to foster implementation and also unblocking some of the issues around our renewable energy independent power producer program. And then there's the public sector capacity, and this is particularly true at a local government level. This cannot be happening alongside of government. Government institutions at the different levels of government would need to play a central role in the way that we're going to be rolling out our investment plan over the next 5 years. And the capacity at that special local government level is going to be key. To some of the lessons, just 5 that I'm going to refer to. The first, the inclusive stakeholder engagement, and this is really the point that I'm making, that the consultation process should be inclusive and consider diverse perspectives. The second, balancing economic and environmental goals. The lesson here is that policies and strategies need to consider both aspects to ensure a just transition. Policy consistency and long-term planning. The lesson here is that investors will need the assurance that the regulatory reforms will remain stable and over an extended period, especially if the type of investments that they are making are investments that stretch over at least a 20-year period. Flexible finance mechanisms. The lesson, developing innovative financing mechanisms, maybe I can say is the only way that we are going to be able to overcome some of those initial cost barriers, and the only way that we're going to stand any chance of mobilizing the levels of resources that will be required. And then the fifth one is just on community benefit and ownership. I think I need to say that this is under lessons, the last but certainly not the least, and probably one of the more critical ones, is that we need to ensure that local communities benefit, and through that benefit we will also enhance acceptance. I mean, if development approaches are about getting authority, gaining acceptance, and identifying ability, acceptance is certainly key in holding those other two together. And then finally, on opportunities, renewable energy industry growth is certainly a very strong opportunity for South Africa, considering this statistic that I shared with you on the level of imports of solar panels. Certainly an opportunity for the growth of solar, wind, and other clean energy sectors that will attract investments, create jobs, and foster innovation. Economic diversification is an enormous opportunity, especially in a province like Mpumalanga that will be the most impacted by the transition. An opportunity to reduce dependency on traditional industries and explore new sectors in the green economy. Third opportunity, community empowerment and ownership, drawing from that lesson that I spoke to. Lead to shared benefits and ownership, including community-owned solar or wind farms, and some regulatory reforms would be required in order to accelerate that. The fourth, infrastructure development. The opportunity is to invest at significant levels in infrastructure development, including grid upgrades and energy storage facilities. And the implementation plan speaks, I think, very clearly to a roadmap and some options for the investments that are required in transmission grids in particular. And then finally, the investment and financing opportunities to attract both domestic and foreign investments, as well as innovative financing mechanisms as a very strong opportunity. And I think in many ways South Africa could lead in this regard, and also as we are the first in having tabled a JET investment plan and the first to table a JET implementation plan, I think located within that we could also find many other first in innovative financing and also some of the regulatory reforms that are required. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Great. Thank you, Neil. Chris, can I ask you to come up? You're not going to present, you discuss.
Can you hear me all right? I don't know if the microphone's quite the right height. Once in the UK, we had a chancellor that liked to sort of slump over the podium, and one that liked a very low one so he could use his hands a lot. And the only solution for an event was to have a podium that went up and down. because the two important people had to be kept very happy. So let me know if I need to lean forward a little bit or if you can hear okay. So thank you very much for the invite to be here. First, I want to pay testament to the important work driving all this forward that comes forward from the PMU, from Sue, Neil and others, and the success that's been made of the implementation plan recently that we celebrated yesterday. So I'm the UK JETP envoy. I lead the IPG on South Africa. I'm also co-leading with the EU on the Vietnam JETP. I'm very engaged with Senegal and Indonesia as well, and also thinking about how we apply some of these lessons in future country partnerships and future engagement going forward. I'm going to touch on some of the lessons learned from an IPG perspective, looking particularly about how some of those might transfer elsewhere. But to be honest, some of these aren't so much lessons learned as things we sort of knew already, but are now sort of living through, so they feel a bit more sort of sharp, and also things that sort of reflect some of the inherent challenges of any approach on the transition. I recognise many of these from our own UK work on transition. Some of them are different, some of them are more acute, but there are many sort of shared experiences in this endeavour of transition. An experience the world over, I think, is that energy policy is actually quite often hard, even before we had to worry about climate change and that imperative. Managing transitions is also something that's quite hard, that governments are often sort of struggling with. And so, the nature of the climate crisis does mean we need to look to maximise ambition, but we need to do that with a degree of humility, working through the real challenges in order to realise the benefits, such as those that Neil touched on. But I know I can speak for the whole IPG and talk about how committed we are to help in that endeavour. And so now I'm going to talk about 8 key takeaways, and then also a little bit about some of the sort of contextual challenges that matter quite a lot for this. I'm going to start off by talking a bit about the role of the IPG, because I don't think that's always sort of perfectly understood. It was sort of outlined yesterday as sort of, the role in the catalytic moment that happened at Glasgow in announcing the original launch of the JETP. But this is very much about a partnership. It's very much about supporting South Africa to deliver South Africa's own just energy transition ambitions. It's about South Africa's NDC goal. And so though there was that sort of headline, big picture, bigger moment, as you get further and further implementation, that moves further and further away. We play a complementary role to that, but the much more detailed work comes at the national level. It comes increasingly local in its implementation side. So it's about delivering those South Africa-owned planned, being nationally led. So it's very much about the spirit of partnership and us engaging constructively in putting forward some of the engagement. But we're very much like every other stakeholder in engaging in large parts of this. We don't have privileged access, apart from perhaps in the finance section, where we need to be very clear about some of our components as part of that. So we make sure that things are factually accurate there, rather than anything else, just because of our role in that section. So on the first key lesson, I'd say the most important point for us is this point about flexibility, about adapting to the realities on the ground. So we sort of understand and accept that the scale of the load shedding challenges have meant that we need to be realistic on the decommissioning schedule. So we can't necessarily expect to shut the plant next year and exacerbate a lot of the crisis. We recognise that. We recognise that the transition is very much the medium-term solution, so it's about accelerating that to create that potential. But also we need to adapt on the finance side as well, recognising that the investment plan from last year had a critical role in terms of the sovereign lending that was due to take place and be channelled, much of which through Eskom. But the moratorium has led to a bit of a shift in thinking about that approach, about what flexibility there is there and what the other routes are as well. So it's about how we adapt that shift from Plan A. It's also thinking about the wider approach, so not just thinking about renewables and building things, so what's the role we can do on energy efficiency and other options such as curtailment. Ideally, you'd have more stability. Ideally, you'd have a bit more stability. That makes it much easier to implement plans, but you do need to react when the realities on the ground change. Second lesson is the need for patience and managing expectations. So after leader level announcements, you very much have this momentum and you want to move very quickly. Everyone wants to hear the next steps, but there are challenges about how quickly you can move on that. So there's lots of parts that need to come together to make this transition work. So you need the headline ambition and the vision. You need clear plans to operate that. You need bankable projects. You need new policies that fill gaps or reform policies, and you need the finance in place. And all of these are quite linked, and they're a bit chicken and egg about how they move. So making progress on one helps make progress on others, but you need to be realistic about how much you can move forward with everything at the same time. So there's this question about sequencing. I suppose the lesson we're taking away from that is, if thinking about future partnerships, how much can we develop some of these plans ahead and have more clarity on that and not have them as on a discussion point, so you've got something that can move quicker from the point of announcement. And also, what can you do, something we think about with our JETP is about having the early projects that can demonstrate those results on the ground, because I do understand the impatience for having the real progress on the ground and the money moving. Next lesson I'm going to talk about is on that actually the experience is that things can sort of move very quickly. So the private investment in renewables that sort of Neil spoke about does show that when the policy reforms are there, actually things can move incredibly quickly. So that's a very positive lesson about how, when the things are lined up, the progress can happen very quickly. So we need to balance this patience with urgency. So there's an urgency from the climate crisis, but also there's a sort of challenge that standing still does mean you're moving backwards a little bit. So the coal plant will keep on getting older and the risks on load shedding will continue to increase. And so there's a sort of a degree to which we need to keep on up with that momentum. I sort of take very much Neil's point about, and it came through very clearly, the point on the sort of consultation and engagement, and that's really important. But you also have a challenge of how that's balanced, given that the progress, the risks, if they manifest, risk exacerbating inequities as well. So load shedding can increase, could increase going forward, and it could mean that those who can afford it are those that have greater access in the future, and therefore, the idea of a transition for all comes from progressing it. Next, I'm talking a little bit about the fourth lesson, I think, which is very clear, which is that there's no transition without transmission. Basically, it's a bit catchy, but it's just painfully true, that is a potential bottleneck in lots of systems globally. So when the private investment can move very quickly, that's what you hit next. The particular challenge there is the lags involved, in that it takes time to both building the projects that are dependent on it, but then before that you need the transmission in place, and that can take a number of years. Particularly at the moment, you've got delays in supply chains, so waiting 18 months for transformers. So that just really brings forward the idea about how quickly you want to move forward with that to avoid hitting those bottlenecks at a later point. We know that there's quite a lot of thinking about the sort of role of financing models at the moment, and so on that side, on the transmission side, we sort of see the benefits of that, but we're also keen to think through what we can do as an IPG to support on the public side before that, to help maintain that momentum whilst those sort of progress take a bit of time to work through. Fifth lesson's on project pipeline. So we recognise very much that, as you try and move forward, that pipeline matters quite a lot. It's an area we're quite focused on in terms of thinking through how our projects can help support that. Ideally, more and more of it is coming through on the ground and being led, but there's things that we can be doing to help stimulate that so that doesn't become a bottleneck. Particularly around, there's areas where things happen more organically with the private sector, so a more vanilla style renewables project. But in other areas, there's a much stronger need for grant finance in other areas as well. So how can we sort of help design that wider portfolio of projects that won't happen as organically to help deliver that? Sixth lesson is the emphasis on just and how we internalise some of those lessons. So it's vital that we learn the lessons from the JET work so far, and make it a success. So read with great interest the PCC's report on the COP28 lessons learned, and how we incorporate that in terms of the timing, the sequencing, the role of consultation, the breadth of the approach that's needed in terms of capturing all those that are affected. And I think we need to learn those lessons sort of quite quickly, because we need to sort of try and scale that if we're going to move from sort of projects towards programmes on that. I don't know if I'm running out of time. I could skip over the finance section. No, maybe not. So I'll touch a little bit on some of the grant finance. I think, like many challenges, I think it would be a lot easier if we had £8.5 billion of grant finance. that would make everyone's lives a lot easier. But we do recognise that, both in climate and more broadly, there are lots of competing demands for grant finance. There's lots of areas in the climate finance space where grant finance is the main solution driving things forward. And so, as Minister Creasy made the point yesterday, there are lots of areas where there are good commercial investments that can be made that deliver returns, and therefore there's a question about where should things be used most appropriately. And it's important that we use that grant finance where it adds most value, it has the biggest impact. Think about blending, think about where we can have the biggest impact. So one example is like UK Work and SME Fund, where we've tried to blend finance that helps leverage the private sector on sort of startup risks in Mpumalanga. So really try and work out where that can have that biggest impact, and really think about how we can draw in philanthropy more into that space as well to help sure that our interventions are aligned and have that biggest impact, because it's the sort of wider package that has that impact. I think the grant component is sort of the premium end of the package, but the other components do matter quite a lot as well. They offer different things and they add value in different ways, and there's a need to scale up on multiple fronts. So just looking at some of the sovereign finance, it is actually quite concessional. So the recent KfW and African Development Bank loans were at sort of 4.4% and 6.3% respectively, and these are sort of loans for sort of 20 years with an 8-year grace period. So that's being compared to current South African borrowing on treasuries of about 13%. So you are seeing like significant reductions in the borrowing costs that come through. So it does offer significant benefits. And ideally, over time, as things move forward, the demand for the sovereign elements actually decreases quite significantly as the policy reforms take hold and other policy areas take place. So that potential pressure on the wider risk of overburdening on South African debt becomes diminished over time. It really is this period where there's a critical need for investment. Need to think very carefully about how we can mobilise wider South African capital markets, including the pension fund money. So that's another area we focused on, where Garrett & Co. Is looking at how we can wrap bonds issued by SMEs to make them AAA rated, so they're more investable by pension funds, and trying to take that forward. And we have had quite a bit of success on the grant side as well. So our grant funding has increased 116% from the original package. This does reflect the idea that as we move forward through this partnership, that 8.5 billion was very much the starting point, and we look to mobilise resources over time, partly because of their nature. Grant resources are sort of looked at more immediately on the project basis, and as you sort of make success, there's this opportunity to scale things up going forward. So we expect that trend to continue, and also as you break through to some of the bigger projects as well, they're often accompanied by that grant component. So I fully accept the point that we're looking for more, we're working on that as well, and that can deliver benefits, but it's just important to see that package sort of in the round and think about the contribution that can make and how that can be the kickstart to reaching towards the sort of giant 85 billion number that Neil was talking about earlier. Final benefit I'm going to talk about is on the final lesson, is on the benefit of cooperation and partnership. So I know my US colleague Alexia sort of talks about JETPs as a process of radical coordination, whereby it's about making all these different parts join up and operate a bit more effectively together. So about how as an IPG we can offer a more coherent voice, a clearer package. It's about engagement, so across us, it's about engagement across the South African government, it's about engagement across different philanthropies, the MDBs, and thinking about how all those parts can join together, local communities. So there's quite a lot of coordination work that adds a lot of value. It's quite labour intensive, but it's critically important for delivering this. We've seen the benefit of drawing in other partners as well. So recently having the Dutch and Danes join the IPG, they bring real expertise. So the Netherlands on agricultural development particularly, and the Danes on energy grids. It's very useful for us to have those additional perspectives. Sort of, we have other partners outside, but having them within this discussion is quite helpful from our side and helps coordinate our offer. One of the lessons were drawing in more partners at an earlier stage that we've tried to apply to other JETPs, so drawing in the MDBs more directly at the early stage so that they're involved in discussions and thinking about the role they can play in future stages. But as you get further into implementation, things get much broader and much more local, and it's about how these different parts join together. Also very important is the coordination hub, both in terms of how we set that up, but also the critical role of PMU. So that's the critical role. We need to make sure that it's resourced properly, that the staff are there and that they're given sort of long enough time so that you're not having different people going up the learning curve and they can keep on bringing their experience. Is that better? Thank you very much. So it's about, and also within government as well, so it's the link up across different ministries, and Neil touched on the point about capacity as well as part of that. So as you get further in implementation, you get more and more different departments that have a particular role to play, and it's not their whole role. It's a small part of their role where they've got multiple pressures, and so therefore that whole process of making that work and things flow down between different people who are juggling different priorities is critical for making that progress. And that comes from the sort of senior leadership, but also making sure that that people are supported to make their roles as easy as possible as they help support it. So from an IPG perspective, it's about sort of engaging. We've expanded our team in Pretoria. So, the role in the initial discussions is much more capital to capital, but now increasingly most of it's being led out of our embassy. So it makes it much easier to have local engagement, to have regular meetings. So we've expanded our capacity in post to take this forward, recognising how much of this implementation is locally focused and how my role from London doesn't give us anywhere near that sort of degree of perspective. So for that granular level, we need to do it. It's about sort of regular engagement and maintaining that progress. So finally, that's it for me. That's 8 lessons. So it's about keeping learning. It's about adapting. It's about maintaining the focus ambition. So particular lessons around flexibility, patience, maintaining ambition, focus on just transmission and project pipeline, utilising finance to help lower costs and fill gaps, and investing the time and resource in coordination. But as I said before, the IPG is very committed to playing our role in that. I look forward to any questions on that as well. Before I hand over to Rainer, who'll demonstrate how the IPG also bring multiple different perspectives with the areas in which he's offers tremendously more insight than myself.
Thank you. I think this microphone is much better. Thank you very much. As you mentioned earlier, I am the special envoy from Germany for the Just Energy Transition Partnership that we have with South Africa. In my former life, I've been dealing with the energy transition in my country for about 35 years. These 35 years, 20 years as State Secretary in various German governments. So I'm well aware that energy transition is a smooth highway. It is a bumpy road. And I want to start by saying a very big thank you, not only for inviting me here today, but especially to the project management unit. Is this better? Okay, thank you. To the project management unit for coming up with this really great implementation plan. I'm well aware of how much work that has been, not only writing it down, but also getting it through the cabinet, because you have to balance between all the different interests that are represented in the South African government. So thank you very much for this very good work. It doesn't mean that I agree with everything. I'm going to come back to that point later, but that does not lower my appreciation for the work you have done. I don't know who in this room has actually, aside of course the project management unit, worked himself through the about 300 pages of this document. I have, and that's why it's not only a polite phrase when I say thank you, I really mean that. So before I start with my comments, I first want to remind us about what actually energy transition in all our countries is all about. It's about moving away from fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas over to CO2-free renewable energy sources by, at the same time, increasing energy efficiency. That's what it's all about. And now, like I said, this is not a smooth way, because you have interest, people who have invested their money into fossil technologies. You have people who have been employed in these areas who are afraid of losing their jobs in this transition. And responsible politicians deal with these problems and work out a good compromise between these different interests. And this is not something that you can do from today to tomorrow. It's a step-by-step process. And that is very important. But looking at the climate situation, it has to be also a fast and not a slow process. I want to say that at the very beginning. So let's look at the situation between the last COP, when we met in Sharm el-Sheikh, and today. When I look at that implementation plan, I see that there is some very clear language in there that puts a priority on energy security. One could say energy security is a priority over the transition. I agree with that, because I don't think that in any country, at least not in my country or all the other European countries that I know, anybody would shut down a coal generator when there is not enough electricity for the people. Nobody does that who is a responsible politician. So when we look at the situation as it is today, I do understand this priority of South Africa, but when we look at the development of the last 12 months, unfortunately we cannot say that in South Africa the situation has improved. It has become worse. 2023 was the worst year when it comes to load shedding, the actual not availability of electricity to the people and to the economy of South Africa. In my eyes, this is the biggest justice problem. Because there is hardly any economic growth. That means high unemployment, and as a result of high unemployment, crime rates, etc., etc. I do not have to explain that. So the question is, why is that? ESCOM is very transparent. You can see the performance of the existing power fleet. And in 2022, last year, we had this energy availability factor, which only means that of 100% capacity, how much was actually in a given time available to produce electricity. This energy availability factor last year was 58%, and now it is below 55. Why is that? The data is also very clear. It is unplanned outages. No generator has 100% availability because you always have maintenance, but that's not the issue. This decrease of the availability factor is a result of unplanned outages. So the efforts that have been taken to solve the energy crisis by making the existing coal generators more available has not worked. So the issue right now is not any politician in your country shutting down any coal generators. The issue is that the coal generators shut down themselves because they're at the end of their lifespan. They haven't been properly maintained, maybe. And that's why, in spite of all the attempts, that is not the solution to the energy crisis. So what you need to do, and that is also very clear in the implementation plan, you have to add new capacity. And the least cost capacity, if you want to have low electricity prices in the future for the people and for the economy, is wind and solar, is renewable energies. So let's take a look at the result of the various bid windows and the public procurement programs. At the beginning of this year, and this is also very transparent from the ESCOM data, from the various procurement programs, in all the years before January 1st, there were 6,280 megawatts of renewables connected to the grid. And do you know how much it is today? 6,280. There has been an increase of exactly 0 megawatt. So you have this decrease of electricity generation from the existing coal fleet, and through the public procurement program, unfortunately, 0 addition of renewable energies. There is one sector that is growing amazingly, and that's rooftop solar. In the meantime now, ESCOM estimates 5,000 megawatts. That's great, that's wonderful. But these 5,000 megawatts cannot compensate, or have not compensated, the non-performance of the existing coal plants and the 0 addition of the public procurement programs, and the result of that is more load shedding. That is the problem. And now when I look at the implementation plan, I see that South Africa plans in this period, 2023 until 2027, so over 5 years, to implement each year, to add each year 6 gigawatts of renewable energies. 5 times 6 is 30 gigawatts. Now 2023 is already over, and if bid window number 7 still comes in December, you evaluate that, you have maybe in January the preferred bidders, but because of this very slow process that takes 3.5 to 4 years, if you have the preferred bidders at the beginning of 2024, by the time they start commercial operation, you might have already 2028. That's outside of that 5-year period. So I don't know how you want to get 30 gigawatts through the public procurement program, because that's what the plan says, that 30 gigawatts should be added through public procurement programs like REAP. I personally believe that is not going to work. That does not mean that you cannot reach 30 gigawatts or more. But the solution to that is the energy reform. And I think there are 3 points that are very, very crucial now, and that, number one, is the energy reform. You have that reform of your energy bill in the parliament. I think it is of utmost importance that this bill is being passed before the election. Otherwise, you're going to have a very, very big delay, and that means it takes much longer to close the gap between supply and demand. Load shedding is going to continue. So please pass that bill before the election. Number two is unbundling. This word doesn't mean very much to many people. What stands behind that is actually that South Africa, as many, many other countries, including myself, the United States, and almost all countries, industrial countries, they started by state-guaranteed monopolies. There was one company that was responsible for generation, for transmission, and distribution of electricity. And what we have learned in the process of liberalization, that you have to separate generation from transmission if you want private investors to participate in that market and invest their money. Why is that? Well, to just paint a picture so you understand what I mean, just imagine the highways, the Autobahns in Germany would all belong to Mercedes-Benz. And Mercedes-Benz would set the tariff for the VWs and the Peugeots and the Toyotas to use that Autobahn. What do you think would happen? You would see many, many more Mercedeses and hardly any other cars on the German Autobahns, right? And this describes the problem. If you have one company that is participating in the market as a generator and at the same time controls the grid, there is a huge danger that the ownership of the grid is used to discriminate against other participants in the market. So this is the experience we had in Germany. The moment when we separated generation from transition, the market got going. Then you see that private investment. So that is the second important step, unbundling of ESCOM, separating it into a generation part and a transmission part to make sure, and this is the third part, that there are very, very clear rules for non-discriminatory access to that grid. If an investor who wants to sell electricity by building its own wind farm or its own solar farm and sell that electricity to a municipality, to a company, or whoever is the customer, there has to be a very clear rule what are the conditions to use that grid, these wheeling rules. They must be very, very clear. And if you do that, and if you do that fast, I think you're going to get out of that problem with load shedding. So the energy bill, the unbundling, and very clear rules for the wheeling are key to solve that problem. And luckily, by solving that energy crisis, you achieve the targets of the energy transition. Because that's the same. It's moving away from the fossil fuels over to the renewables, because if you allow the market to act, the market knows that wind and solar in South Africa are the cheapest source, and that's where they're going to invest, because they're competing with others, and they, of course, want to offer the best price. Now, let me close by coming back to yesterday's session. I was sitting in the last row when Joanne was presenting the implementation plan, and Barbara Creasy, and you had a very interesting discussion, and Ines, you participated in that discussion, and you painted a very nice picture, which I liked, about somebody breaking his neighbor's windows. And what you meant by that was, they are the industrialized countries in the north who have created the climate problem, and Africa has contributed only 2% of the global emissions, but of course is suffering now from the emissions that have been created elsewhere. I think, first of all, that is true. That describes our responsibility as industrialized countries. But I want to remind you that South Africa and Africa are not identical. Yeah? And if you put, I'm talking about the historical emissions, because the historical emissions are important. What has, over the decades, been emitted by different countries? And if you put the countries that are here at this COP in an order of who has contributed most and who has contributed less, number one is the United States of America. Number two is the European Union. That's our responsibility. Number three is China, which is pretty soon going to surpass Germany. And do you know who is number 10? South Africa. So you're not only a victim, yeah? So we are in this together. And we have to organize this energy transition in all countries, and your country, South Africa, is a key, together with all the other ones who emit, to make this energy transition a success and to achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much for listening.
Can I swap over? Thanks. Thank you, Rainer. Thank you very much indeed. Colleagues, I'm going to move on just to talk about the next steps that the PMU is going to take, just to give you a sense of how we're thinking to prioritize some of the key interventions that need to happen next. And then after that, I think we've got a nice chunk of time to take discussion on some of the key issues that I think the panelists have raised for us today. I'm also going to pick up on a couple of these key points in my next steps, because I think there's a nice correlation there. The implementation plan actually sets out a clear roadmap on how we're going to go forward, and it talks about the priorities that need to be implemented straight away. And I want to just mention two enablers, which I think are extremely important, that we're going to do from the presidency side, and then to talk about some of the key priorities that we're going to put critical resources into to really try and problem solve, because we do have some sticky things that we're struggling with. And the first of the enablers is this JET funding platform that we've undertaken to set up. And we started by issuing on the President's State of the Nation website the register of grants that have been committed to South Africa for the JET IP. And I think it's a first, because at last we're actually making public what these grants are and how they're being spent and who are the recipients. And there's going to be no better way to run this just energy transition than by being very transparent about where the money's coming from and where it's going to and whether it's having the impact that we need it to have. So we need to get all these mechanics in place. So the register is out there, and we're going to start building on it to show where the loans are going as well as where the grants are going. And I can talk a long story about how we want to make better use of the grants, because at the moment we've got a very old-fashioned relationship, if I can say, about grants, and that's a one-on-one relationship. Take in $1, spend $1, get another $1, spend another $1. And we think that that is not optimal. We've got to actually use these grants and leverage other resources to get $10 out of the $1 or $100 out of the $1. And I think we can be much smarter about our use of grants. So with the funding platform that we're setting up, we want to start with that bucket of grant finance. It's the only cash that's actually moving in the 8.5 billion right now. And I want to say that clearly. The concessional loans have not moved, and there are reasons for that. And I'm going to talk about why we need to focus on some of those challenges now. But let's look at the $700-odd million that are sitting in the grant bucket. And let's make sure that we're actually starting to use that money effectively to where it needs to go. So this funding platform is going to be a matchmaker. It's going to say, what grants do we have? What projects do we have? How do we bring these grants together with the projects to actually make them start moving? And part of the problem and the challenge, and Neil highlighted this, is project management, project preparation is not where it needs to be on the ground, especially at the level of community level driven entrepreneurship and, investing in new businesses. So part of this platform is going to be to set up a project prep support facility so that we can actually help people to prepare projects and to access the funds. So it's quite a big enabler, which we think is very, very important to get going, and it is an important next step. So I've talked about those two enablers. And then I suppose the big money. If we don't fix this transmission problem, we're not going to get the renewables into the system. We have to fix transmission. It's absolutely critical blockage right now. Eskom doesn't have the cash availability to invest at the scale that is needed in the transmission grid. They do have a transmission development plan. They have allocated approved capital investments, especially after the debt relief. They do have cash available to start moving some of these projects at a better pace. But we know that 300 kilometers a year is not going to do it. We need, 1,400 kilometers a year. So this is a big jump between where we're at the moment in Eskom's capacity and where we need to be. So the private sector is waiting to invest in transmission, and we have models that I think there's increasing agreement that we're going to have to develop out these models, but we've got to find the funding solutions for them. Now, and we've also got to have the wheeling agreement in place, the wheeling mechanisms in place that offer a free trading system and a fair trading system. So there's regulatory work to be done. And there's also fiscal constraints. So the fiscus doesn't want to enter into major new loans on a sovereign basis, and neither do they want to be burdened with sovereign guarantees. So we've got to be very smart about how we start to make use of the concessional finance that is available. Can we channel it through other sources? Eskom is not able to borrow at the moment, so we need to think of alternatives. And the private sector is waiting to invest. There's no shortage of private sector capital for the jet, that we know. And we just have to unlock it. So this conundrum, this grid investment thing is really what's keeping us awake at night. Because if we don't solve that, we're not going to get renewables onto the grid. The next is that we've got the Accelerating Coal Transition Investment Plan, which is the Climate Investment Fund's commitment to South Africa of $500 million US. 50 million of that is grant capital, and 450 is highly concessional funding. So that is funding for the repowering, repurposing, decommissioning of the coal-fired power stations. Now, we know that the closing of coal-fired power stations is being rescheduled because of the electricity crisis that we're in, but the decommissioning will eventually happen. These are very, very old power stations. So it's not a matter of if, but when. So what we want to do is we want to front-load the repowering, repurposing, and community development work, do that as quickly and as intensively as we can. And then when the decommissioning happens, hopefully there's already economic activity that has been redirected. People have a view of the future. They can see hope. They can see jobs. They can see livelihoods. And there will be a smoother decommissioning than we've seen, say, at Komati. So I think and Neil has highlighted those lessons, which are extremely important. But the ACT IP finance comes bundled with World Bank finance, African Development Bank finance, and IFC finance. It's a package. And we've set that out in the implementation plan. So it was assumed that the borrower of that package would be Eskom. That was the original intention of that whole plan. Eskom cannot be the borrower anymore. So now we've got to get very smart about how we're going to unlock this particular package of financing for this very critical area of investment in our energy transition. So it's high up there on our priority list of next steps, and the PMU is working hand in hand with Eskom and others to unblock this particular set of challenges. And then we do have investment-ready projects. I mean, I think what's really interesting is in green hydrogen and electric vehicles, which the IDC is leading on with the private sector, and these are all private sector investments. There are entrepreneurs out there who are doing incredible work, developing new opportunities in these new sectors. What we've got to do is unlock some of the credit enhancement that is needed for those new investments to actually take off. And I think we're going to be spending a lot of time working with financiers to see how we can unlock those investments further. Many of them are ready to take off, which is really exciting, and I think we've got to find ways to make that happen. And then from an institutional point of view, and this is speaking to capacity and resources and actually being able to get the work done, the implementation plan sets out a very structured architecture for each one of our portfolios. So we're saying there has to be a secretariat that heads up each portfolio, and that's a dedicated secretariat who can actually drive the work in that sector. And then forums of co-creation with all of the stakeholders in those areas. And we need to resource those up and get them moving so that people are participating in the planning of the sector work going forward. So everyone's willing. We just need to get the mechanics of these systems up and running, which I think we can do fairly quickly. And then, of course, in the background, we've got monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and we need to start implementing those systems that we're actually able to learn as we go. And what we don't want is kind of 5 years along the line, say back, okay, let's have a look at what we've done. We want to learn as we go along, and where there are mistakes, we've got to fix them. So we need a very agile M&E system where we're actually engaging constantly, and that's why these forums are important, because we need to evaluate what's happening, take the problem back into the forum and say, okay, we've got a problem, how do we fix it? And we're going to have to be very quick and agile to do that. So this whole implementation approach is a co-creation one. There's no way this jet energy transition is going to happen unless all of the stakeholders are part of it. It just cannot actually happen. So we've got to take everyone along, and it's got to be a solution for everybody. And that's where we're headed. So I wanted to give you a sense that we've kind of learned as we've gone along. The financing is not straightforward. The concessional loans are struggling to move, mostly because Eskom can't borrow and the fiscus is under pressure. So we're not getting these loan agreements moving at the pace that they need to move. But we will find solutions, and we will find a way forward. Okay, so let's open up for discussion. I think we've got half an hour to go, which is great. So who wants to start? Any questions or comments from the floor? Bodi, thank you. Oh, here we go. Sorry. Here's the mic.
Thank you. I don't know if I must stand.
Yes.
You see, I was listening to the presentations, and I get to understand where the presentations comes from a good place.
Yeah.
But you see, I was looking at just transition as the aspect that we need to look into carefully. It began to take shape right at the time when we were in the euphoria of transitioning from the old regime to the new one. Disappeared within the euphoria. Whilst other people would have had, and I heard he said he had 35 years of working with that. I don't think that there may be, here in South Africa, people who have worked for 35 years in just transition, non-stop to where it is now, to where we have developed it to be. If you look at all the documents that talks of just transition, for instance, they took shape in the past 4 or 5 years. Now you can see you've got a framework, you've got the JET IP, you've got a way of implementing all those in a short period of time. And I also listened elsewhere to the trade unions that comes from other countries. They were speaking of how they could have preempted it way beyond 35 years, which means they started a long time ago to have an idea of what it is to do. All that I plead for us who are sitting here, is to understand that with all the competing challenges, socioeconomic challenges that we have in South Africa, we understand when other people say maybe the speed should be this much, maybe the speed should be that much. But we need to consider that we cannot have to choose between living, about development and dealing with socio-economic challenges. We don't even have to choose between that and dealing with climate. We just need to find a balance that we need to deal with climate, but at the same time, we also need not ignore that which is bedeviling us. And if you look at the stats of what I'm saying, your inequality, it's one of the worst. All these things, they need to be dealt with, and they are competing. And you can't do it with your fiscus. So in essence, all you must do is to try to find help elsewhere. But when you do that, you don't stop to run. Still deal with climate change issues. The last point that I want to make is the biggest fear of dealing with this haphazardly is that you may end up, even if it comes from the good place, with privatization of a generation of electricity in South Africa, which probably may not work well for us now that we are having these challenges that we're having. And I think other countries and that have developed far better than us, they may not have the same challenges that we have. With people who are unemployed, if you switch their electricity off as a private hand, you know very well that there is nothing else that can be done. But if people are employed, which they are not, you've got a different set of challenges. My point is just that maybe we need to understand the context and understand that the pace may be a little different from the pace elsewhere because of our socio-economic challenges.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Mbudi. Yes, sir. I'll take 3 or 4 questions and then I'll ask the panel to respond. Okay.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Maybe just 2 principles that I want to emphasize. I think Neil just touched on that, but and then I had the privilege to many times in being in Dr. Barker's lectures, and always marvelous to spend time with him. But similar to what we're seeing in Germany in terms of the North-South dynamic, in terms of energy and transition, similar in South Africa is the East-West dynamic. Our West activation is quite pertinent for us, and our Eastern side we cannot relinquish because that's where the social-political dynamic is. So that awareness, we tend to say a lot, pardon, I'm from the Northern Cape, so we're driving, and the Western Cape corridor, so we drive extensively the Western SADC hydrogen corridor. So the principle just there is we always joke with our local communities, which is, and then it's not a joke, it's a very harsh reality to say, do not think in 10 years you're still going to be speaking Afrikaans. You might be speaking Venda or Xhosa or Zulu then at that stage. It's going to change. South Africa's landscape is going to change. The dynamic of energy is going to change. And that awareness, we haven't drafted as South Africa and communicated effectively yet, because it's 130 years of instilling an energy-driven economy with the related services industrialization now, which we will say, does it become now an energy supply economy or a re-industrialization or a supplementary industrialization? So that consistency of methodology, and Dr. Barker and them has got a lot of experience where they're seeing north towards Schleswig-Holstein, whereby we're seeing the Stuttgart starting to slowly but surely moving closer towards the energy now as well. And it's not a major move yet, but it's a move that can be anticipated with the mineral resources. So number one, I need to emphasize that. Number 2 is I need to emphasize to reach energy equilibrium in South Africa. I hate the word energy poverty. Energy equilibrium is far better, but hydrogen is such an important niche for us as well, because our oversupply and generating capacity in that, our peaks and our valleys will supplement, but also the grid storage. Even when we in Germany, when we were with Dr. Barker and them, the role that it can play in terms of storage space to have our 24 cycle then basically. And that economy we mustn't underpin, and I'm grateful to see that we boldly stating green hydrogen now. So we must parallel invest, and the common denominator remain grid. Absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Yes, I'll go here and then I'll go there. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. My name is Andile Mlambo. Yes, from Grassroots for Climate Action. Thank you for the presentations. And I think listening to the presentations, I think we are on track. However, on what Neil was talking about, especially on regulation, I just wanted to find out more, especially as a country when we're having opposing forces. For instance, we have the BRICS Plus. This is it's about finance and investments. UIE is going to be part of the BRICS Plus, which is financing. Then we have the IPG Plus, which the US is part of that. And with the US, we have the AGOA, which is speaking about imports and giving people access to export, even if it's fossil fuels. So those opposing forces, I feel, is an issue for me. And I'll tell you why. If we're going to speak regulation and then the regulator does not fall under a Chapter 9 institution, then we're going to still have challenges where, as you were saying, rightfully so, where the player is still the referee. But if you can have the regulating fall under a Chapter 9 institution where it's independent from politicians, it's independent from, then we don't have to worry much of who's going to win the next elections and stuff because we know it's independent. Thank you very much.
I haven't heard that issue raised in these forums today, so thank you very much for raising it. All right, I think we've got 3 substantive inputs. Let's take your responses on all of them, starting with Mbodi's issues around the pace, the socioeconomic realities of South Africa, energy access and security of access for very poor people who might be vulnerable to private sector profit-driven motives. Let's have your responses on that. Secondly, on the geographic issues around how the energy landscape will actually have a huge socioeconomic impact in the country over time, and maybe some lessons from Germany in that regard. And then thirdly, on this issue of the international geopolitical landscape and how those contesting forces globally might impact on our financing solutions in South Africa. All right, let's start with you, Rana, and then we'll move across. Thanks.
I'll stand up so we can see each other better. Enos, on the question of speed, first of all, I want to say that we as IPG, international partners, we can offer money, we can offer our advice, but we respect that all political decisions are being done by the elected South African politicians. We do not interfere with that. I just want to say that very, very clearly. It's your country, you decide. Now, when I look at the situation and you say, slow down the transition, I do not see any South African politician who is purposely closing down a coal generator right now. As I said before, they are so old that they close down themselves. And I've watched now, over the last year, the attempts of the responsible people in your government to keep up this energy availability factor, which is only meaning the availability of the existing coal generators to produce electricity. And the result is they're producing less than they did in the year before. So politicians can do a lot of things, but they cannot change the age of the coal generators. They are simply old and they have a problem. So what do you do in that situation? You either accept the reality or you put your head in the sand. And putting the head in the sand means that you might slow down this process a little bit, but at a very, very, very high price. I think the biggest injustice right now in South Africa is the non-availability of electricity to serve the people and the economy. That, in my eyes, is the biggest injustice. So what do you do then? And the only realistic path that I see is invest in the cheapest available technology. And if Eskom doesn't have that money, and if the public procurement programs have only increased absolutely 0 megawatts in this year, then you need that private capital, whether you like it or not. But there is probably no other way, because I said, the coal generators perform less and less. The public procurement programs at least in 2023, have not added any additional capacity, but there is private money going into solar and other technologies in the future. So my suggestion would be get involved in this process and put forward your demands to make sure that this private investment doesn't lead to unfair conditions for the consumers. But we had the same concern in Germany. We liberalized our markets in 1997, and this was also more or less the same time as the energy transition, at least in Germany, started. And I tell you that this energy transition without private investment would not have worked. Yeah, we started in 2000 with our EEG, our support scheme for renewables, pretty much at the same level of renewables that South Africa has today. This year, we're probably going to, for the first year, succeed 50% of renewables in our power system. Our power system is stable, and the renewables on the power market make electricity prices cheaper, not more expensive, cheaper. And look at the average cost of power generation from Eskom today. It is above 1,000 Rand per megawatt, above 1,000 Rand. Look at the result of the last bid window, number 6 for renewables. It was 600 for solar and 900 for wind. So renewables are cheaper than your existing. I'm not talking about new investment into fossil fuels, into your existing, already depreciated coal generators. So if you want to do something good for your consumers, you invest in the cheapest technology, and that is wind and solar. Thank you.
Thanks, Rene. Chris?
I am too tall. Yeah, I think on those points on pace, so my background is an economist, so we're very much thinking about costs and benefits on both sides, and a decision you don't take, you have responsibility for that as well. And so it's about evaluating those, and if there are particular trade-offs on the pace, if there are particular impacts, then they need to be reflected on. From my perspective, there is that opportunity cost of not doing things. So you need to sort of incorporate that in decision-making, think about the benefits that aren't being realised from different decisions. If you're looking at the big picture, and from my perspective, it does look very aligned, making progress on this agenda, making progress on development as well. So if those things are aligned, then it's about how do you realise those benefits, how do you support those that are affected in the transition, the knock-on impact for how you adjust those. You need to incorporate that and think about how you're managing that transition very, very carefully, and think about where there are frictions.
You need to lift the mic.
How that affects pace, then you definitely need to incorporate that where there's clear. But I think that that's not how I'd see many of the issues at pace at the moment, from my perspective. But if evidence does become contrary to that, then that obviously has to be reflected in that decision making. 35 years from Rainer working on these things, I think that reflects partly how much of a trailblazer he was in this. So I started work on this issue 20 years ago, and there was 30 people in our climate change division in the UK then. We now have whole departments working on this issue. And just how much the opportunities have changed then, how much bigger the opportunities are is astonishing during that period. Geopolitics, I think we have enough challenges without going into the global tensions. I wouldn't necessarily see it as a particular challenge, in the sense that there are different countries, different groupings working together that are trying to offer things, that it's up to the South African people, South African government, to think about which opportunities they take, what's on offer from different parties. We cannot and should not and can't stop investment from other countries going in. That's entirely other people's job to get on with that. So there's different offers, different opportunities that are being put forward that are choices for the South African people to take forward. And I think in some areas they are quite complementary. There's sort of the cost and what's being produced and offered by China is being sort of realised with investment in lots of different countries. I think some of what we're offering in different areas is different and unique and adds value to that. So it's a sort of to the extent there is competition, that's potentially an opportunity for South Africa to see what's on offer, see what's being provided by different parties, and you have the control of that. I'm trying to think if there's anything I missed out. Maybe access.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.
Neil?
Maybe I'm going to leave the choices to Sue, and I'll deal with pace and the geopolitics. I really appreciate the Commissioner bringing up this issue of pace at several of the forums where I see him, where he's present. Because I think it is a complex issue, but I think we do need to approach it not as if it is a science, but approach it as an issue that is going to have to be context specific. And there's a beautiful lesson in a nursery fable, The Tortoise and the Hare, which is really a lesson in a smart approach to running a race. And it's firstly about taking the local context into account, accelerating where you should be accelerating, slowing down where you should be slowing down. And if we were to compare that to a train journey, that train can be moving at a faster rate when the terrain allows it, but it has to stop at every station. And it should be going slightly slower when the terrain dictates that to it. And I think that is the way that we are going to go at a pace that is going to ensure that no one is left behind, not only in terms of the outcome, but also in terms of the process that is undertaken. So I think it's something that we always need to be aware of. Where do we accelerate, and when do we need to slow down? On the geopolitics, I think we should be undertaking the transition and not letting the geopolitics get in the way. I think that's going to be the only approach that's going to work, for the country. And what's important is, for South Africa, just needs to be saying, this is our plan. And we're going to take control of the implementation of this plan, including taking control of the financing of that plan. And the way that you take control of the financing of a plan is what I raised at a earlier session that was convened by Oxford University and the World Bank, is to take the approach of a fiscal policy analysis, that our plan is going to cost over the next 5 years $85 billion US. We're going to need to mobilize resources from different sources. It'll be government investment, it would be grants, it's going to involve the private sector, and it's also going to involve a fair amount of reallocation or reprioritization. And the way that we're going to get the private sector to invest in the plan is obviously that we need to create that enabling environment. We're going to need to ensure that we cater for the kind of risk that the private sector considers when it undertakes such an investment, because it's not like we can just ignore the need to provide that enabling environment and to do that credit enhancement, because that source of financing does require that. But at the same time, we are still the owners of the plan, and we are still the owners of the way that the plan is going to be financed. And it's also the way that you're going to be able to bring in the international investors, whether it is China, whether it is the group that makes up the IPG, IPG Plus, and also other investors. But I think it's about, let's transition and not let the geopolitics get in the way of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Okay, I think we've got time for another round of 3 questions. Yes, go for it. Thank you. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
okay,
you
great.
can. I think
Thank you very much. My name is David Thompson. I'm the acting coordinator for Power Africa, U.S. government-led initiative. I'm based in Pretoria. I've been working on the JETP for several years now. I'm also from another energy transition challenged country you've heard of. Now, we've heard a little bit about being smart with the funding, the available funding. It's moving quicker than the financing. We've heard about the need for quick wins, some evidence, but we've also heard about the perception, the fair perception that perhaps there's a trade that it's one or the other, either economic growth and jobs or the just energy transition. And I think it's our obligation to address that. I don't believe that there is a trade, that we have to pick one or the other. It's actually both. We can, South Africa can achieve incredible economic growth and jobs with its transition, but we have to be using the resources that we have together with the government to show that it works. So we're working on job training programs in Mpumalanga. We're going to Limpopo, and things are happening, but it's really at a slow pace so far. So I just wanted to hear about maybe others examples of what we could be doing now to bring more folks on board this transition. As much as I've tried, I've never won a race by running slowly. I've really tried. However, in this case, running slower, more deliberately together is what we need to do. So I just wanted to hear more examples about how we can do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was another question at the back. Thanks, sir. Can you, yeah.
Hi there. Is that working? Hi, Evan Lieberman. I'm a professor of political science at MIT, and I have the same accent as the previous speaker. It seems to me that a dominant narrative in South Africa, and that's been heard loud and clearly abroad, is that the reason for South Africa's energy problems is a mix of incompetence, corruption, and low-level crime and thievery of power lines. And I mean, I know that that's not the entire story, and that a lot of it has to do with choices about investment because there were other competing needs early in the transition. But there's also some reality to that narrative. But so I guess my question is, as you're putting this forward, I mean, both the reality that underlies that narrative and that narrative has to change for investors and for trust in government around future investment. I don't see how one could go forward with this plan without a political plan to address both those realities and perceptions. Wonder if what's going to be done about that.
Okay, I'm not sure anybody on the panel is in a position to really address that question, but thank you for raising it, and I will come to it. Is there another hand that we can deal with another issue before we go to responses? Anybody else? No? Okay. I wonder if I could just go back, Rainer, on this issue of the geography of the transition. As you move to different sources of energy in different regions of the country, how that affects the growth and transformation of the economy and people's lives. If you could maybe just share some insights from Germany on that. I mean, I think it was a point that was raised earlier, and it was worth getting a response on. So let's start with that. I will come back to your question.
Yeah, but I have to point out that the situation in Germany and South Africa are very different.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So I don't want to say follow the same path and do the same things because of very many reasons. But as I said at the very beginning, the energy transition in Germany was not an autobahn, a straight way forward. It was a very bumpy road. And when we started in the year 2000 to phase out nuclear and started our support scheme for renewables, energy transition in our parliament, for the right part of the parliament, was a swear word. And the big newspapers wrote energy transition in quotation marks. Hardly anybody remembers this, but this is only 23 years ago. And during my last time in government, between 2014 and 18, it was very difficult to talk about a coal phase-out without big demonstrations of unions and prime ministers in those areas where most of our lignite generators are. Times have changed. I just read an article yesterday of the prime minister of that coal region, Brandenburg, that's the area around Berlin, who now proudly presents to the news media all the new investment that is taking place there, research institutions, the Federal Railway System building an institution to fix the ICC cars, because we never so much talked about just energy transition in Germany, but we always organized it as a just energy transition because we knew if we don't have public acceptance in a democracy, you cannot be successful. So there has been an incredible development in Germany, and what happening is actually right now is, since most of our renewable capacities, the new ones, have been built in the north, not exclusively, but to a large extent, now some of the new investment of industrial complexes go where the renewable energies are, because they want clean electricity, because they are under the pressure of their investors, of their boards, of their employees who want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Yeah? So in the past, our states in the south, like Baden-Württemberg and Bayern, you know, they were used to, whenever there was any kind of a big investment, investors would go down south because they have very good educated people, excellent infrastructure. And now all of a sudden they see Tesla going to Brandenburg, a new chip factory going to Magdeburg, that's all in the north, and the new battery factory going to Schleswig-Holstein at the border to Denmark. So this is a reality right now that is opening the eyes of some of the people who were very, very skeptical about the energy transition in Germany, and we had quite a few people who we had to convince. So now let's talk about South Africa. Okay, as I said, I think the situation here is very different. You talked about the grid problem. First of all, and we talked about this issue the first time December 2021 actually, when I came with Robert Habeck, our Vice Chancellor, and you just had your bid window number 6, and 3,200 megawatts of wind energy couldn't be connected because the grid was supposedly full. I knew that issue because we had the same issues with our grid companies, so I brought down one of them. They sat down with Eskom. We paid a study, and they showed if they have a smart curtailment system, that means simply using the existing grid in a more smart way, they can bring in several thousand megawatts of additional renewables. And you probably saw in the newspapers that the interim CEO of Eskom says, if we would have known that, what EGI and 50 Hertz have showed us now, back in December 2021, we could have connected the 3,200 megawatts. So the only thing that is missing right now is the approval from NERSA. I hope it comes soon, because that is much faster than expanding the grid. The grid expansion is necessary. I'm not arguing against that, but in the meantime, you can use your existing grid in a much more efficient way. Second point, I think South Africa should look carefully at where they actually want to build the renewable energies. I mean, if you look at it from an investor's point, you go to the best sites where you have the best wind condition and the best solar conditions. But what good does it do if you don't have a grid there? If you cannot evacuate that electricity? So I think that South Africa should think about investing in renewable technologies in those areas that have excellent grid connection. That's, for example, the Mpumalanga region. Okay, maybe the wind condition and the solar conditions are not as good as in the Western Cape or Northern Cape. Maybe not as good, but they're still much better than in most parts of Europe. Yeah? So I think this is good for the energy transition because it goes much faster, and then you invest in those areas where, in the long run, jobs are being lost because the coal generators sooner or later are going to go. And it is much more important, also in terms of just energy transitions, that new jobs are being created in those areas where jobs are being lost. Yeah. So that might be a little bit less efficient for the renewable energies, but it is faster and it is more just because then you have jobs in that area where jobs are being lost, new jobs where jobs are being lost.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Anna. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so I'm going to wrap up. But I hope the messages come through that the just energy transition is an economic diversification and development plan. They are not separate. We have to do the transition, but we'll do it in a way that actually creates livelihoods and jobs, and we must. So I think just the point about, people are out there wanting to do good stuff, and they've got little bits of projects here and there. What this implementation plan is trying to do is to focus attention on specific areas where we can rally resources and unlock investment in particular activities that are coherent and integrated. And I think that's what where the opportunity lies in the ACT IP, because there's specific coal plants that will eventually close down, communities that are dependent on the value chain. I think once we get these project management teams in place for those areas with co-creation with local communities, we can then start directing investment in a more structured way. And I completely agree with you. I think Eskom already agrees as well. We need to build renewable energy at the Mpumalanga sites, close to the grid where there's plenty of capacity. And that's an absolute winner in the first instance. Completely agree. On the perception of corruption and the reality of corruption and the other problems that we've had, I think we've just got to continuously work at this challenge, and we've got to continuously prosecute those who can be prosecuted. We've got to build our institutional systems. We've got to put robust protections in place. There's no shortcut. We just have to consistently work at it and get it right. And where we do get it right, it unlocks incredible investment. When we had the IPP office running really well, there was huge trust in that process. And the investment flowed. It moved quickly. So as soon as you get an institutional model that people can see the transparency, the integrity, the quality of the human beings that are running the show, the funds flow, the investment happens, and things actually transform. So we know that, and we've got to get it right. There's no other way around it, and there are no quick fixes. We just have to keep going. I think a lot has been done, but a huge amount still needs to be done. We have to build a capable state. We know that. All right, I'm going to end it there. We've run out of time. So thank you very much to the esteemed panel, Rainer Bakker, Chris Taylor, Neil Cole. Thank you. And thank you all for your attention and your wonderful contributions. Have a good day further.